and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. For this episode, I'm joined by Earl Bardsley, Honorary Associate Professor at Waikato University's School of Science. Earl, welcome to the Of Interest podcast and thanks for joining us. Now, back in 2005, Earl wrote an article published in the Journal of Hydrology, highlighting the possibility of a pumped storage reservoir at Lake Onslow in Central Otago, which he said had the potential to more than triple national hydropower energy storage. It could be held as a dry year reserve or operated continuously on a seasonal basis, the article suggested. Fast forward to 2019, and the Interim Climate Change Committee, which was the precursor to the Climate Change Commission, advised the government that a pumped hydro scheme at a scale that could solve New Zealand's dry year problem shows promise, recommending the government investigates the potential for pumped hydro storage to eliminate the use of fossil fuels in the electricity system. The Interim Climate Change Committee said this could help lift New Zealand's electricity generation to 100% renewable from 82%, which is where it was then. Then in 2020, 15 years after Earl's article, Energy and Resources Minister Megan Woods announced the government was allocating $30 million to be spent on developing a business case for a solution to address New Zealand's dry year storage problem, focusing on a pumped hydro storage project at Lake Onslow. Woods said the move was a step towards a goal of 100% renewable electricity generation. Now part of the New Zealand Battery Project, last year the government awarded a consortium led by engineering consultancy Mott MacDonald a $11.5 million contract for a feasibility study into a pumped hydro storage scheme at Lake Onslow. Earl, I just thought it'd be good to start off by asking you, how does it feel to have the government spending a significant amount of money investigating the feasibility of an idea that you floated all those years ago?
Well, I guess I'm flattered, of course, that the idea is finally getting taken up. Although I have to say, on the personal level, I do have mixed feelings to some extent. On the one hand, it's easy to get big-headed and say, hey, I'm going to be the person that's going to enable the green transition. But on the other hand, there are downsides on the social aspect, and that some of the farmers involved are put into a situation of uncertainty because they don't even know what's going to be happening sort of from 1 month to the next, and I do feel sorry for them. So I'm trying to remove myself as far as I possibly can from both the positives and the negatives.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack here. So I think if we start at the beginning, can you explain what a pumped hydro scheme is and how it works?
Yeah, pumped storage is just another way of energy storage. You can think of it just like a battery. You put some energy in and you can get some energy out later on. It's simply a container to hold energy until it's actually needed. The way that pumped storage specifically operates is that you pump water up to a high elevation and it stays there until it's needed. So the energy stored is in the form of gravitational potential energy.
So when you penned that article back in 2005, what was your initial thinking behind the idea, and has this evolved over the years?
Yeah, I should add that I'm not an engineer. I'm coming through from sort of the environmental geographical point of view. My background is in geography at the University of Otago. And my basic idea back then was to locate a site which had sufficient storage that we could take some of the storage capacity away from the New Zealand hydro lakes, because those lakes are beautiful natural scenic lakes, and the large amount of seasonal storage change that happens in those lakes, plus the fact that they've been raised, has a pretty massive impact along the shorelines. And I was hoping to sort of revert them back to some extent more towards their natural situation of having relatively small seasonal variation. So it was very much an environmental background.
Okay, so why did you come up with Lake Onslow as the place? I mean, what was the great appeal of Lake Onslow?
Well, I searched around, just a matter of looking at topo maps really, and I needed to, if there was a place anywhere in New Zealand that could do it, it would be a high basin above a large water source, either a lake, maybe even the sea. And when you scattered around, it actually turned out that Onslow was pretty much the only place that you could do it for that sort of scale. A lot of pump storage schemes around the world have relatively small upper reservoirs where you store the water because they just work on a daily basis. But when you're looking at dry year reserve, you need an awful lot of water up there in order to give you the gravitational potential energy to take you through the dry time.
So if the project does go ahead, how much water could it hold and how much electricity could it generate?
I can't give you a figure for the amount of water holding off the top of my head, but it's measured in cubic kilometres, just to give you an idea of the scale, maybe 2 cubic kilometres, and that's an awful lot of water. And the actual energy storage, the capacity for generating power is reasonable. We're looking at currently at 1,500 megawatts. That's larger than Huntley, although that's not unusual in the world scale of pump storage. In the sense of the actual energy stored, we're looking at something like 5,000 gigawatt hours. And that actually, as far as I can tell, would be the largest pump storage scheme in the world by energy measure.
So the scale of this is massive then. I mean, we're talking about
storage
something
is
that...
definitely massive, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what would this do for, I guess, electricity supply in New Zealand and also potentially electricity prices?
For electricity supply, the idea is that it will simply enable us to maintain renewable power through dry years. So we can keep the hydro and the wind maintaining our power supply, provided Onslow is there helping things along. So that's essentially what it comes down to. And in terms of prices, yes, it will have a very significant effect on prices. Presently, the prices tend to be highest in winter and lowest in summer, reflecting the seasonal demand. And also the fact that often in winter we have to have fossil fuel to bolster up the extra amount of power needed. And with Onslow, that would replace the fossil fuel component, and Onslow would be cheaper to run. So we would see that the seasonal variation in power prices would be much reduced compared to what they are now. And hopefully the overall power prices would also be somewhat lower because you're taking off the expensive fossil fuel component out of the equation.
So Transpower has estimated that electricity demand could grow by up to 70% by 2050 as we, I guess, start driving more electric vehicles and we electrify the process heat being energy primarily used for warming spaces and industrial processes. So this is, the green transition, as you mentioned at the beginning. Would Onslow, the Lake Onslow pumped hydro project, would it meet all of this requirement?
Will meet hardly any of those requirements because you have to remember that Onslow is not a power generator; it's a power storage. So the energy is going to come mostly from wind.
So would it assist with that wind though? I mean,
yes. It's the bad thing about wind, of course, is that it's intermittent. It's intermittent on a quite a fine timescale compared to say the hydro variation, and Onslow, by being both a pump and a generator, can actually pick up those variations in wind fluctuations. So in other words, roughly speaking, the amount of energy generation capacity, or power generation I should say, at Onslow, if you double that, that represents the amount of extra wind that it would enable. So if you had in the order of 1,500 megawatts of installed capacity at Onslow, that would enable a new amount of wind energy of about 3,000 megawatt generation capacity. So it's a big deal in that sense. So in that way, Onslow is a generator of power, but of course, pump storage schemes are always net negative in terms of energy.
Would this project also, I mean, we have talked about the green transition and obviously we're importing coal at the moment, which is trucked from ports or trained from ports down to the Huntley Power Station or across to the Huntley Power Station if it's coming in through Tauranga. Could the Lake Onslow project help to end the burning of fossil fuels for the production of electricity
yes.
in New Zealand?
Yes, the way it would work is that Onslow would provide an upper price ceiling. So as the prices tend to creep up, then what would happen normally, what happens at present, is that when the prices go high, that's when it becomes economic to fire up coal burning. With Onslow in operation, what would happen is that as the prices started to creep upwards, it would be economic for Onslow to start generating. And that would have the effect of bringing the prices back down. So in effect, you're putting a ceiling onto the wholesale electricity prices such that it would simply not be economic to burn coal. So if Onslow gets started, there's just no way that Huntly is going to be economic. It wouldn't need to be shut down. It would just simply shut itself down as by virtue of not being economic to operate anymore.
I guess it would be good to have a look at some of the practicalities of this scheme. Where would the water come from to fill the lake?
Well, Onslow is a high basin located above the Clutha River, and the Clutha River is New Zealand's largest river by discharge measure. So what would happen is that we would be pumping water up from the Clutha River, storing it in Onslow, and returning it back down to the Clutha River. So in a sense, the Clutha River is like a lower reservoir, although in reality you would never be using the same water twice, because when you pump it, when it goes back down to the Clutha River, it flows on down the river.
This would be a massive public infrastructure project, and construction would, I'm sure, involve thousands of workers. Estimated cost is $4 billion, and we're not sure yet how it would be funded if it does go ahead. But how long would the whole project take to finalisation?
That's a difficult one, of course, because we've got the COVID impact and so forth now in terms of labour availability and so forth. The government initially was talking about 100% renewable electricity by 2030, and I don't think anyone these days sees Onslow as being, if it goes ahead, as being completed by 2030. So maybe we're looking more towards, I don't know, maybe perhaps 2035 or that sort of order. But one point that should be made about Onslow, though, you don't have to wait until it gets full up with water before it becomes useful. So you could, when you start pumping, you immediately increase the available storage capacity of the New Zealand hydro system. So it starts right from the beginning of the pumping operation.
Okay, so it could be a progressive, I guess, benefit to New Zealand's energy supplies coming on stream over a period of years?
Yes. So it will you need to take a while to fill up a lake like that. And that happens to any hydro lake. You fill it up in stages. You don't just go pumping furiously and until it's full. In fact, Onslow may never be full, because once it's full, you've lost the pumping capacity. So yes, initially when you have only a small amount of water in there, it could only be pretty much used for wind energy support. But as you get more and more water in, then it comes back into its role of seasonal support and also for dry year support.
Okay, so in terms of the challenges, with water, evaporation can be an issue. So would evaporation be a problem or indeed leakage?
Leakage, not so much. The base rock is schist, and that's not an aquifer. It's very impermeable material. So I think we're okay on that score. Evaporation is at its maximum extent, Lake Onslow would be about 1/10 the size of surface area of Lake Taupo. So there is potential there for evaporation loss. Well, it will happen. And it will be in the order, I think, in terms of energy, of something less than 10 megawatts energy loss. So in other words, you're going to have to pump a little bit more water up there to offset the water loss to evaporation.
Obviously, there's a initial feasibility study going on at the moment. I'm sure you have a fairly good idea of what the terrain is like there yourself as well. So, I mean, what do we know about the terrain, the soil, clay, rock? I mean, is it all suitable for such a massive project? And what if it isn't?
Yes, the terrain overall is very good. Just going through some of the specs, if you can compare it, for example, with the Clyde Dam. Now the Clyde Dam was actually built on a fault. So it's the same rock, but the rock was highly shattered, and it took an awful long time to excavate out the foundations for the Clyde Dam before it could be built. Onslow is removed from faults as far as the dam site is concerned, so that's good. Now the other aspect is the slopes going down into the lake. We've got rock slopes going down into Lake Onslow with a thin soil cover, and compare that, for example, with the Cromwell Gorge, which has oversteepened slopes, and always was a risk of landslides into Lake Dunstan. So from that point of view, Onslow ticks a few boxes.
You mentioned that the Lake Hydro scheme would be the biggest, or sort of among the biggest pumped hydro schemes in the world. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about one or two of the bigger ones in operation overseas and how significant they are in the countries and economies they're based in.
Yep. Well, pumped hydro schemes have two numbers associated with them. One is the power generation capacity, that's how big the generators are, and the other is the energy storage capacity. In other words, how long could those generators keep running for before you run out of water in the upper reservoir? So in terms of energy storage capacity, it would seem that Onslow is the largest in the world at 5,000 gigawatt hours of storage capacity. The next largest is the Soudal scheme at 3,300 gigawatt hours of storage capacity in Norway. In terms of generating capacity, Onslow won't be any more than about 1,500 megawatts. And the largest in the world in terms of generating capacity is in Bath County in Virginia, and that has 3,000 megawatts generating capacity.
And obviously there's a big one under development in Australia, Snowy 2.0. One of the things that has been, I guess, interesting there is that it is taking quite a lot longer, or a lot longer than was originally expected, and costing a lot more. I just wonder, with those sort of potential for cost blowouts and delays, I did see one critic talking about the Lake Onslow scheme here as think big all over again. I mean, if there are significant cost blowouts and delays, is it still going to be worth doing?
It's hard to answer that properly, because in a sense you've got to look at all the advantages that Onslow is going to bring and sort of weigh that against the cost, and also how long it would take to pay the money back. But in terms of comparison with Snowy 2.0, Onslow is definitely looking much better, because Snowy 2.0 is only going to have an energy storage capacity of about 350 gigawatt hours. Now you can compare that with 5,000 gigawatt hours at Onslow. So for bang for buck, we do much better in terms of energy capacity, even if it explodes out to $10 billion, which I doubt it would.
You mentioned right at the beginning, I guess, your concern that you have for the farmers and people who live around Lake Onslow now, and the uncertainty that this is going to cause them, or is already causing them. So there is obviously farmland there. It's a popular fishing spot, I believe. So there's fishing huts and wetlands there, and some endangered plants and fish. Obviously, constructing the pumped hydro scheme will it's designed ultimately to reduce. Well, it will ultimately reduce carbon emissions across New Zealand, but building it will produce carbon, causing some climate pollution. And I understand that the Department of Conservation is undertaking a study of environmental and conservation values at Lake Onslow and its surrounding area now, and looking at how this might all be affected. I mean, I guess, from your perspective, this is obviously an area you have some knowledge and interest in. If the scheme does go ahead, I mean, how much of this will be lost, and will it be worth it for the greater good?
Again, that's a very subjective call. There is certainly going to be environmental impact at Onslow, in the sense we're going to be losing some wetlands. On the other hand, there will be some environmental gains as well. The most obvious one will be the change in the flow of the lower Waitaki River. Now, originally, before hydro was developed on the Waitaki River, its natural seasonal flow regime was for high flows in summer and low flows in winter, because winter precipitation in the Southern Alps comes down as snow. Now, with the introduction of hydropower and storage in Lakes Tekapo and Pukaki, the seasonal variation of the Waitaki River has been pretty much flattened out. And to some extent, Onslow will move the river flow back to where it was before, because it'll be more economic now. Rather than holding the water back in Lake Tekapo and Pukaki, I would imagine Meridian will be inclined to sell it to Onslow in terms for pumping. And that will result in more water going down the lower Waitaki, putting it back to some extent to where it was before for both recreational and irrigation use. So that will be one environmental advantage that will happen quite regardless of anything else. There are other aspects that we could look at in terms of environmental offsets, spending a bit more money to actually construct something useful in the environment. Well, one that I particularly like, and I'm just sort of messing on the top of my head, is that just over the hill from Onslow, there's a high valley, and that actually could be used to create deliberately a natural lake, in the sense that you build a dam, but then you just simply leave it. And for all practical purposes, it's a natural lake for recreation, fishing, and also as part of an upland reserve to protect some of the rare species around the place.
So the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which is overseeing the New Zealand battery project, which obviously includes investigating the feasibility of a pumped hydro scheme at Lake Onslow, is saying that there'll be some feasibility decisions around the technical, commercial and environmental issues around December, towards the end of this year. And then there's obviously some further work ahead starting in 2023, looking at final investment decisions, detailed investigations into construction, funding and potential implementation of the preferred option or options. And this will cost about $70 million, they're saying. Now, obviously, New Zealand is committed to decarbonising. We've got the Zero Carbon Act that's gone through Parliament, net zero emissions target by 2050, and both major political parties have bought into this. But their ideas on getting there, I guess, could be different. And this pumped hydro scheme would be a very big public infrastructure project. These typically attract criticism. So I'm just wondering whether you have any concerns that the Lake Onslow project could become a political football in 2023, which is an election year.
Well, assuming that the government decides that it would like to go ahead with Onslow, it would only become a political football if the National Party takes the view that it would not continue with the scheme should it become the government. Presently, we don't know what the National Party policy is on Onslow, and I guess they will announce that sometime during the election campaign. One attractive aspect of Onslow which may appeal to the National Party is that they've been on record as supporting water storage for irrigation development and against dry periods. And Onslow, even though it would be very expensive water, could be available water as last resort in an extreme drought, which could conceivably arise in the sense of climate change. Onslow actually is quite good in that respect because, for example, it could also form the basis of a backup water supply for Dunedin City as well. So it's got multiple facets in terms of water supply under extreme conditions, like what we saw, for example, developing in Europe earlier this year.
So look, Earl, just to sum up, I mean, what's your gut feeling? Do you think that this project will go ahead? And what's your key selling point, the reason why you think it should?
I think the key selling point, I'm sort of trying to second guess what the New Zealand people think on average. I think the key selling point would be that it's an enabler to get rid of fossil fuel power generation. And secondly, even more than that, it's an enabler of the green transition. So we can actually go ahead and move into EVs, maybe green hydrogen, because it's just not obvious to me that there are other mechanisms around by which we can actually do that. Maybe there's something else will come out from the NZ battery study, but as far as I could tell, Onslow will be certainly the most technologically effective because it's very standard technology and probably cost effective as well. But again, we'll have to wait to see what comes out in terms of the NZ battery study later on in December or early January.
Absolutely, and we'll be watching that with interest. It's going to be fascinating to see where things go from here. Thanks a lot, Earl, for your time. That's Earl Bardsley, who's Honorary Associate Professor at the Waikato University School of Science, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.